Welcome to Robert's Record Corner. I'm Robert, and today I brought a whole bunch of Rolling Stones albums. That's because I would like to talk about the 7 distinct eras of the Rolling Stones, which I've graphed right here. The Rolling Stones have been around for almost 6 decades, and they have tons of studio albums, and a lot of them can be kind of grouped together as little streaks within their career. You can kind of lump them together, and I find it useful to do that when you evaluate an artist like the Stones or Dylan or Beatles or whoever it is by grouping their periods of time, and you can boil it down to 7. I'm going to talk about these 7, and I want you to know it's a little bit controversial because some people on Twitter got really mad at me for not having Let It Bleed as its own era somehow. Here's what I mean. 7 eras. The first is Roots Down. 64, 65, Mick and Keith, 21, 22 years old. They're basically making recordings, the stuff that inspired them to play guitar and sing and play live in the first place. 66, 67, they kind of took a pause from that and started writing music, and I call it their Beatle bumming period because they were kind of mindful of the Beatles, mindful of fads. By 68, they launched the Big Four, albums that would define their entire legacy, that anyone in rock and roll, if they had made one of those albums, would be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, after that greatness, you had a 70s lull. Albums that were pretty good, but not as good. But miraculously, they had to come back. During the disco punk age, 78 with Some Girls through 81, they have a new guitarist, Ron Wood. They have a new purpose, still making hits, a little bit scary still. Then the 80s was a total crash. They were fighting, they weren't sure if they were going to continue as a band, there was bad solo careers happening, and then they decided to go for the long haul. We're going to be a band for the rest of our lives. They became like a machine, and they became Stones Incorporated, mining the past and making as much money off it as possible. Let's go into detail with the 7 eras. Roots Down, 1964 to 1965, the Rolling Stones released 5 studio albums in an 18-month period. It's amazing. Rolling Stones, England's newest hit makers. That's basically a marketing slogan for their first album. It's a good album. It has the song, cover song Not Fade Away by Buddy Holly. Second album, 12 by 5. That's 12 songs by 5 guys. Includes Time Is On My Side. The third album is Now with an exclamation point. That has Little Red Rooster, which was a #1 single in England, the only blues song ever to top the charts in England. It wasn't even released in the US. This is actually my favorite of the bunch. Fourth album, boom, Out of Our Heads. They get the asterisk for the Stones. Not sure why they did this. This album is very big because it has Satisfaction and Last Time on it. These are 2 songs that are the proto-Stones. They were driven by guitar riffs. The Beatles noticed, they did Day Tripper like a couple months later, and the song Satisfaction in June of 65, I will argue, is better and more important to thinking of rock and roll as a medium of serious art than anything the Beatles had done at that time. The Beatles are tuneful, gorgeous songs, but Satisfaction escalated it. That's this album. 5th album's December's Children. The asterisk is back. Get off my cloud. The second period is when I say is the Beatle bum period. In 66 and 67, all these British invasion bands, Stones, Beatles, Who, Kinks, Animals, they had been raised off African American music essentially, and they started making that music and covering that music and making songs like that. Then they went to the United States, and then they came back to England, and they spent a little time thinking about who they really are. And they experimented with instrumentation. They started using harpsichords and horns and xylophones and sitars. And so the Stones did 3 albums: Aftermath, Between the Buttons, and Satanic Majesty's Request, which is a stunning thing. And all of these albums, every song was written by the Stones. So 66, 67, the Stones are really trying to figure out who they are in writing songs, but they're following trends. Paint It Black's a great song, but it's not a classic Stones song in the sense of who the Stones would become. It's driven by sitar. Under My Thumb, also on Aftermath, xylophone. Lady Jane, harpsichord. Then you get to the piano-driven Let's Spend the Night Together, or the strings on Ruby Tuesday. Then an all psychedelic album with Satanic Majesties. They were clearly trying to follow the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's by doing this complete crazy psychedelic album, and I'm really impressed by how much more psychedelic this is than Sgt. Pepper's. I mean, they went all out. I mean, She's a Rainbow was a top 20 hit in the US, but it's generally not well known. This album's fascinating. Most people would say that Aftermath is the album to get. I think this is the one to get from this period because it's so fascinating that the Stones would be willing to go that far. Now, one thing that they did when they went that far is they drove their producer, Andrew Loog Oldham, crazy, and he quit the band. So, the third period is where the Stones become the Stones. They find a new producer, an American named Jimmy Miller, and he helps them find their sound beginning in March of '68 with the song Jumping Jack Flash. And it's that point that the Rolling Stones really understand. They go back to riffs, which is kind of a remake of Satisfaction. And then they launch into 4 unbelievable albums, their best albums. Beggar's Banquet, Sympathy for the Devil, Street Fighting Man, Let It Bleed, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Gimme Shelter, and a country version of Honky Tonk Woman that came out just before this came out. Sticky Fingers, they have a new record label, Rolling Stones Records. Andy Warhol did their cover, has Brown Sugar and Wild Horses and Can't You Hear Me Knocking on it. And then double album, some consider the greatest rock and roll album ever made, Exile on Main Street. They called it that because the Stones were on exile from taxes in England. They moved to France and they recorded that, most of it, in the basement of Keith's house in the south of France. I mean, it has Tumbling Dice as a single, has Happy as a single. Neither of them was as successful as some of their previous stuff, but the album is raw and rich. If you get one album from this period, Exile on Main Street is it. The Stones really did no wrong in those years, and afterwards they had a little malaise after the greatness, the 70s lull. 3 albums. Goat's Head Soup, It's Only Rock and Roll, Black and Blue. Now I like all these albums, but they're simply not as good. The band is getting into their 30s, they're starting to have kids. Keith's doing too many drugs. He gets busted in France for heroin, so they find that Jamaica is the only place that would give the whole band working visas, so they record this in Jamaica. Recently, Mick Jagger said that Goat's Head Soup is the only album ever recorded in Jamaica that has 0 trace of reggae whatsoever. The album's pretty good, but it doesn't quite have the energy of the previous 4. It's Only Rock and Roll has the great title track. Black and Blue is after their guitarist Mick Taylor left the band, so they're trying out all these guitarists with Black and Blue. This is the best one of this bunch in my opinion because they're having fun, it's light, they're doing a lot of different styles, Mick's hilarious, and it just sounds a little bit better. I think this is kind of the sleeper of that period. Black and Blue is the best album, and it has my favorite kind of unknown song, Memory Motel, which is a long, meandering electric piano ballad where Mick and Keith share the lead vocals. The first time since Something Happened to Me Yesterday from '67 that they did that. Only 2 times in their career they did that.
Something happened to me yesterday. Let's drink to the salt of the earth.
Punk and disco came, '77. And a lot of people doubted that bands like the Rolling Stones had any merit to exist anymore. They were has-beens. Mick got pissed, and it launched the last stand of the Rolling Stones. 3 great albums with their new guitarist Ron Wood. Some Girls has the disco flavor, Miss You, fantastic song Shattered, Beast of Burden. One I really think is one of their top 3 best albums. Emotional Rescue, which is kind of a remake of this. It has a little bit of punk, has a little disco, has a little funk, has a little rock, has a little blues, has a little country. Not as good, but it's a great minor album by a still great band. And then you have this miracle, Tattoo You. I mean, this was recorded over 8 years and it was cast-offs from previous recordings that they didn't put out. Somehow, they miraculously put it together. It sounded fresh, it sounded unified, and it became their last great album. It starts with Start Me Up, the iconic song, and ends with Waiting on a Friend, with Sonny Rollins playing the sax solo. People should have this album. The 80s was cruel to almost everyone, and the Stones are no exception. I mean, David Bowie had a terrible 80s. Paul McCartney was making bad movies. Led Zeppelin had broken up, The Who would break up, and the Stones didn't know if they were going to be a band. Mick wanted to do solo career. He did a string of horrible solo albums. When they're at Live Aid, Mick did Rolling Stones songs as a solo set, and then Ron and Keith came right on stage right after him to play with Bob Dylan. Very awkward. They managed to squeak out 3 albums during this 80s crash. Undercover has the title track Undercover of the Night, the best song of the period, kind of a political song during the Reagan era about Central American politics. The album cover is distinctive, but the album is a bit all over the place. This terrible album cover is Dirty Work, more of a Keith album, but it's not that redeeming. It's right after Mick's first solo album and Live Aid. They came back in '89. At the time, everyone thought this was a comeback. Steel Wheels, but look at that stupid album cover. And it kind of hints at the machine that they would become in their last period, Stones Incorporated. I mean, the best song of the period might be Undercover, the best known song, but the best song to really have is the Keith ballad that ends this, Slipping Away. Kind of an underrated song, not a single. I think it's the last great Stones song. That's over 3 decades ago. Final Stones period I call Stones Incorporated. Over the last 30 years, they have released 4 studio albums. Voodoo Lounge, Bridges to Babylon, A Bigger Bang, and an all blues cover album, Blue and Lonesome. Now, none of these are essential albums. They're okay, but they're mainly made so that they can tour. And then when they tour, they do a live album. And then they tour to support the live album. And then they do a live album of that with a DVD, and then they tour to support that. And then they have a new greatest hits package with 1 bonus new song, and then they tour to support that. So they've become mining the past. Let's go back to my list, the 7 eras. And you'll notice there's a line right here. And this line is delineated between when the Stones mattered. They were a purposeful band, they were a little menacing, they were scary, they were relevant, they were getting #1 songs, they were angering your parents. And then what came after with the 80s crash and the Incorporated period is this: they became a nostalgic act. Now, when you're 77 and you can move like Keith and Mick and play these songs that are undeniably great, do it. You have every right to do that. But just don't buy it.
Second